Jake Carter loved the woods. They were quiet, peaceful, and full of life. He often hiked alone, enjoying the fresh air and the sound of birds singing. His golden retriever, Rosie, was his only companion. She loved exploring just as much as he did. One cool autumn afternoon, Jake was walking deep in the forest when he heard something strange. It was a soft, weak whimper. He stopped and listened carefully. The sound was coming from behind a fallen tree. Rosie's ears perked up. She let out a small bark and ran toward the sound. Jake followed, pushing through thick bushes and stepping over broken branches. Then he saw it. A tiny creature lay curled up beside the log. It was shivering, its fur damp and covered in dirt. It looked like a puppy, small, fluffy, and helpless. Its eyes, big and golden, stared up at him with fear and sadness. "Oh no," Jake murmured, kneeling down. "Where did you come from, little guy?" The puppy let out another weak cry. It looked hungry and scared. Jake's heart ached. He checked around the area for any signs of a mother or other puppies. But there was nothing. No tracks, no sounds, nothing but empty woods. Someone must have abandoned it. Jake sighed. "I can't leave you here." Carefully, he took off his jacket and wrapped the puppy inside, holding it close to his chest. It was so light, barely more than skin and bones. Rosie sniffed the little creature but didn't wag her tail like she usually did when meeting a new dog. Instead, she stepped back, tilting her head. Jake frowned. That was odd. Rosie loved puppies. Still, he had no time to think about it. The sun was starting to set, and it would get colder soon. He needed to get home. As he walked back through the trees, he whispered to the puppy, "Don't worry, buddy. You're safe now." The little creature didn't respond. It just blinked up at him with those golden eyes. Eyes that seemed to hold a strange, wild light. But Jake didn't notice. He was too busy hurrying home, unaware that this puppy was something else entirely. Jake hurried back to his cabin with the puppy tucked warmly in his jacket. Rosie walked quietly beside him, still acting strangely. She would glance at the puppy every so often, but didn't get too close. Jake didn't think much of it at the time. Rosie was a loyal dog, and maybe she just needed time to get used to the new pup. When they finally arrived home, Jake gently set the puppy down on a soft blanket by the fireplace. He stoked the fire to keep the cabin warm. Rosie watched from the doorway, her eyes wide and uncertain. "Come on, girl. Let's make sure our new friend is okay," Jake said, trying to calm Rosie with a smile. Rosie hesitated, but eventually, she trotted over to the blanket where the puppy lay curled up. The little one was already asleep, its breathing slow and steady. Rosie sniffed at it, then let out a low growl. Jake raised an eyebrow. "You're acting weird today, Rosie. What's wrong with you?" But Rosie only gave a soft whimper and walked away, lying down on the rug a few feet from the puppy. Jake sighed and went to check on the pup again. It was much smaller than Rosie, its fur dark with shades of brown and black. The little thing looked like a typical puppy, except for its eyes. Jake had noticed that the puppy's eyes were unusually bright and sharp. There was a depth to them, like it had seen more of the world than a normal dog would. But Jake dismissed the thought. It was probably just his imagination, he told himself. After all, he hadn't spent much time around puppies. He gave the puppy some water and a little bit of food, which it ate quickly, its tiny body trembling. Then Jake pulled the blanket over it and sat down beside Rosie. "We'll figure this out tomorrow. You just need rest, little one." That night, Jake slept lightly, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest outside. Rosie stayed near the door, keeping watch. In the morning, Jake woke up to the soft sound of scratching at the door. He opened his eyes to find Rosie standing up, her tail stiff, staring at the blanket where the puppy had been. But when he looked over, the puppy was gone. Jake jumped out of bed, his heart racing. He rushed to the door and opened it. There, sitting on the porch steps, was the puppy, looking up at him with its golden eyes. "Hey, "What are you doing out here?" Jake said, his voice still thick with sleep. The puppy didn't answer. It just stared at him, those sharp eyes studying him closely. Then, without warning, it stood up and trotted into the woods, vanishing into the trees. Jake ran after it, but by the time he reached the edge of the forest, the puppy was gone. He stood still, breathing heavily, staring into the deep woods. He had no idea how the puppy had gotten out, but he felt uneasy. Turning around, he saw Rosie standing by the door, watching him with a worried expression. Okay, let's go after it," Jake muttered. But just as he started to move forward, he froze. He realized something strange. The puppy had moved fast, faster than it should have for its small size. Jake had seen puppies before, and none of them had ever run that quickly. A feeling of unease settled over him. Something wasn't right. He took a deep breath and called out for the puppy one more time. "Come back, little one. We're not done yet." But there was no reply, only the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Jake turned back toward the cabin, uncertainty settling in his stomach. There was something more to this puppy than he had first realized, and he needed to find out what it was. The next few days felt strange. Jake couldn't stop thinking about the puppy's odd behavior. He'd searched the woods for hours but hadn't found a trace of it. His heart told him that it would return, but his mind couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Back at the cabin, the little pup stayed by the fireplace, its golden eyes watching Jake with a kind of sharpness that unsettled him. Rosie had been acting strangely too. She no longer seemed to trust the puppy. Whenever it got too close, Rosie would growl low in her throat and back away. She refused to play or share food with it, even though she was always friendly with every other dog she met. Jake couldn't understand it. He wanted to believe that the puppy was just like any other dog, but there was a strange, wild energy around it that he couldn't ignore. The puppy seemed to change every day. It was growing fast, much faster than any dog he'd ever seen. In only a few days, its legs had become longer, and its fur had thickened. It wasn't just the size that bothered Jake. It was its behavior. The puppy would sometimes sit very still, staring into the trees outside the cabin, as if listening for something. One evening, as Jake was preparing dinner, he noticed the puppy wasn't in the cabin. He turned to Rosie. "Where's the little guy?" Rosie's ears perked up, and she stared at the door. Jake followed her gaze. He opened the door to find the puppy standing on the porch, staring into the forest. The setting sun cast long shadows, and the woods looked eerie in the dimming light. "Hey, come here, buddy," Jake called. The puppy didn't move. It just stared, its body tense. It was as if it was waiting for something. Jake walked toward the puppy slowly, but before he could reach it, the little creature turned and ran. Fast, faster than he had ever seen a dog move. It dashed into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. Jake stood still for a moment, his heart racing. He could hear the sound of the puppy's paws on the forest floor, the rapid pitter-patter fading into the distance. Something inside him told him to chase after it, but he knew it was useless. The puppy was already gone. Rosie stood at his side, staring into the woods with an expression of worry on her face. Jake let out a deep sigh. "What is going on with you?" he whispered. He was starting to feel more and more like something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. Over the next few days, things got stranger. The puppy would spend hours outside, roaming the forest on its own, never straying too far from the cabin, but never letting Jake get close either. When Jake would try to call it, the puppy would always glance at him with those sharp, knowing eyes, then dart away into the trees. And each time it returned, it was different. Its fur seemed thicker, its eyes brighter, its movements more confident, like it was becoming more and more wild. Jake started to wonder if he should be doing something. Maybe he should take the puppy to a wildlife expert. He needed answers. One evening, when the puppy returned from its latest run in the woods, Jake decided he couldn't wait any longer. He was going to find out what was really going on. As the puppy approached the cabin, Jake crouched down in front of it, his heart pounding. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "I need to know what's going on with you." The puppy sat down in front of him, its golden eyes locked onto his. For a moment, everything felt still. Jake held his breath, as if waiting for the answer to come. But all he heard was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then the puppy stood up again and ran back into the forest. Jake sighed, realizing that this mystery was far from over. Jake couldn't stop thinking about the strange behavior of the puppy. It had been days since he'd seen it run off into the woods, and it was becoming harder to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. The little creature was growing faster than any puppy he had ever known, and its actions were becoming more and more unpredictable. One afternoon, after spending hours looking for the puppy in the woods, Jake finally gave up. He was about to head back to the cabin when he heard a soft sound behind him. He turned around to find the puppy standing quietly at the edge of the forest, watching him with those sharp golden eyes. This time, it didn't run. It simply stood there, waiting. Jake approached slowly, his heart beating faster. The puppy didn't move, but it seemed to be staring at him more intensely than ever before. He crouched down, feeling the weight of the moment. "Where do you go, little one?" he asked quietly, though he didn't expect an answer. The puppy blinked, and then, to Jake's shock, it tilted its head in a way that reminded him of a wild animal, something not quite like a dog. He reached out a hand, and the puppy allowed him to touch its fur. It was much thicker than before, and it felt almost like the fur of a wolf. Jake pulled his hand back quickly, suddenly realizing something he had ignored for days. This wasn't just any puppy. Jake's mind raced as he thought back to the first time he found the little creature. The strange eyes, the wild energy, the way it moved. Everything about the puppy felt out of place. Now, looking closely at the animal in front of him, Jake felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. "This isn't a dog," he whispered. "It's not a dog at all." His stomach sank. He had heard about wild animals being found in strange places, but he never imagined something like this would happen to him. Jake had a sudden, terrifying thought. What if this wasn't just some lost puppy? What if it was something far more dangerous? Jake stood up, his hands shaking. He needed to know for sure. There was one place he could go to get answers. The local vet, Dr. Hayes. She was the one person he trusted when it came to animals, and she had seen everything from rare breeds to wild creatures. With determination, Jake picked up the puppy and carried it back to the cabin. Rosie, as always, was keeping her distance, watching the puppy with a wary eye. Jake quickly grabbed his keys and headed out to the truck. The puppy didn't struggle as he placed it gently in the back seat, its golden eyes still fixed on him. He drove to Dr. Hayes' clinic, the uncertainty weighing heavily on his mind. When he arrived, Dr. Hayes was already waiting for him. She had heard about the unusual puppy Jake had found in the woods and was eager to help. Jake set the puppy on the examination table, and Dr. Hayes immediately began inspecting it. She carefully examined the puppy's fur, its eyes, and its teeth. Then, without a word, she pulled out a small stethoscope and checked its heartbeat. The silence in the room was tense. Jake couldn't take his eyes off the puppy. Dr. Hayes finally looked up at him, her face pale. "Jake," she said slowly, this isn't a puppy." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "This is a wolf pup," Dr. Hayes said firmly. "A rare, endangered timber wolf." Jake's world seemed to tilt. He could barely process what she was saying. "A wolf?" he asked, barely able to believe it. "Yes. And you need to be careful. Raising a wild animal like this could be dangerous for both of you. It's best to release it back into the wild, where it belongs." Jake stared at the wolf pup, its golden eyes still watching him with a quiet intelligence. He had to let it go, but the thought of losing the little creature was unbearable. "Can't you keep it here?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Hayes shook her head. "I'm afraid not. Wolves belong in the wild, Jake. They can't be tamed. You've done the right thing by bringing it here, but now it's time to let it go." Jake stood there for a long moment, torn between his heart and his mind. But deep down, he knew she was right. The wolf belonged in the wild, where it could live free. Jake's mind raced as he drove back to the cabin. He had just learned that the little creature he had thought was a puppy was actually a wolf, a rare, endangered timber wolf. The weight of Dr. Hayes' words kept replaying in his head. You need to let it go. Wolves belong in the wild. But how could he do that? After everything he had been through with the pup, he couldn't just turn his back on it. The little wolf had no family, no pack, and no place to go. Jake felt responsible for it, like it was his to protect. When he got back to the cabin, he let the wolf pup out of the truck, its golden eyes watching him carefully. Rosie stood at the door, still keeping her distance from the wolf. Jake walked inside, feeling more confused than ever. The fire in the fireplace crackled, but the warmth didn't reach his heart. He couldn't stop thinking about what Dr. Hayes had said. What if he kept the wolf? What would happen to it? Would it be happy in the cabin, or would it be miserable, longing for the wild? He glanced at Rosie. She was lying on the rug, staring at the wolf pup with a strange expression. It was like she understood, like she could feel the pull of the wilderness in the air. Rosie was a smart dog, and she knew something Jake hadn't realized yet. "Rosie," Jake said softly, "what do you think I should do?" Rosie didn't answer, of course, but she stood up and walked toward the door. She looked back at him, as if urging him to make a choice. Jake sighed deeply, walking to the window and staring out at the vast forest beyond. He had spent so many years in these woods, and now it felt like the wilderness was calling him, pulling him in a way he couldn't explain. He had always felt connected to nature, but now he was feeling something different, something deeper. The wolf was part of the wilderness. It didn't belong in a cabin with him. It belonged out there, in the wild, where it could run free, where it could learn to survive and grow strong. Jake knew what he had to do, but the thought of letting go of the wolf hurt him. That night, he didn't sleep. The little wolf was lying on the floor, curled up by the fire, but Jake couldn't stop thinking about the next day. It would be the hardest thing he had ever done, but he had to take the wolf back to the woods. As the sun began to rise, Jake took one last look at the wolf pup. The creature was still small, but its fur was thickening, and its eyes seemed brighter than ever before. It had grown so much in such a short time. Rosie stood by the door, watching Jake. She seemed to understand that this was the moment. With a heavy heart, Jake grabbed his jacket and opened the door. The cold morning air hit him, but it didn't matter. He needed to do this. He couldn't keep the wolf. He walked into the woods with the wolf pup at his side. As they moved deeper into the forest, Jake felt a mix of sadness and peace. The woods were quiet, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath his boots and the soft padding of the wolf's paws. Finally, they reached a clearing where the trees opened up to a wide open field. The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of pine and fresh earth. Jake crouched down and looked the wolf in the eyes one last time. "You're free now," he whispered. "This is where you belong." The wolf stared at him for a moment, as if understanding. Then, with one last look, it turned and ran into the trees. Jake stood there for a long time, watching the wolf disappear into the wild. He knew he had made the right choice, but it didn't make saying goodbye any easier. Rosie walked over to him and sat by his side, her warm presence offering him comfort. Together, they stood in silence, knowing the wolf was where it was meant to be. Days passed, but the weight of the wolf's departure stayed with Jake. Every time he stepped into the woods, he half expected to see the wolf pup watching him from a distance. It had been hard to let go, but Jake knew he had made the right choice. Wolves belonged in the wild. They needed to be free. Still, something inside him told him the wolf hadn't truly left. He had spent so much time with it, watching it grow and change. He could still feel the connection between them. The bond between human and animal was stronger than he had realized. One afternoon, Jake decided to take a walk through the woods again, hoping the fresh air would clear his mind. Rosie trotted along beside him, still acting a little distant, but always loyal. As they walked, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they reached the edge of the forest, Jake stopped in his tracks. He had heard something, a soft rustling in the bushes, followed by the sound of light footsteps on the forest floor. Jake held his breath, his heart beating faster. Could it be the wolf? Had it come back? Rosie stood still beside him, her ears perked up. She was listening too. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jake saw it, a shadow darting between the trees. His heart skipped a beat. There it was again. The wolf. Jake didn't hesitate. He took a step forward, calling softly, "Hey, little one. Is that you?" The figure paused, and for a brief moment, Jake thought he saw those golden eyes staring back at him through the shadows. But before he could move closer, the wolf disappeared deeper into the woods, moving faster than he could follow. Jake stood there, frozen, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? Was it truly the wolf? He wasn't sure, but his gut told him it wasn't just his imagination. Rosie was already at his side, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. She didn't seem scared, just curious. Jake's heart pounded. There was no doubt now. The wolf was back. "Come on, girl," Jake whispered, trying to steady his nerves. He began to follow the trail, staying close to Rosie, who was sniffing the ground with excitement. They moved deeper into the forest, the path becoming more difficult to follow. The trees grew thicker, and the underbrush was dense. The air felt different now, heavier, like something was about to happen. Jake pushed forward, determined to find the wolf, to understand why it had returned. As they moved through the trees, Jake began to notice the signs, the broken branches, the paw prints in the dirt. The wolf had definitely been here, and it wasn't alone. Jake's heart raced as he followed the trail deeper into the woods. He could hear the faint sounds of something moving ahead, soft footsteps, like a creature trying to hide. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Was the wolf leading him somewhere? Suddenly, Rosie stopped and growled softly. Jake froze, his eyes scanning the shadows. Then, in the distance, he saw movement. The wolf stood at the edge of a small clearing, its golden eyes glowing in the fading light of the afternoon. It wasn't alone. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The wolf was standing beside another creature, a larger, more powerful-looking animal. It was another wolf, this one even bigger than the first. It was dark, with fur that blended perfectly with the shadows of the forest. It was like a wild, untamed spirit, watching Jake with the same sharp, knowing eyes. For a moment, everything was still. The two wolves, the wild and free creatures of the forest, stared at Jake. He could feel the weight of their gaze, as if they were silently acknowledging him, as if they knew him. Jake didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, taking in the moment, understanding that the bond between him and these creatures was deeper than he had ever imagined. They had chosen him, in a way, and now he had to choose them too. Jake stood in the clearing, the two wolves watching him in silence. The golden-eyed wolf, the one he had found and raised, was by his side, its body tense but calm. The larger wolf, darker and more mysterious, stood a few steps away, its piercing eyes never leaving Jake. Rosie stood by Jake's side, growling softly, but her ears were pulled back, as if she, too, felt the weight of the moment. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jake could feel it too, something deeper than just the wolves in front of him, something ancient. For a long time, no one moved. Jake didn't know what to do. He was torn between the life he had known and the wild, free world these wolves represented. Part of him wanted to stay with the wolves, to be part of their world, but another part of him knew he belonged in the cabin, with Rosie and the life he had built. But the longer he stood there, the more he realized that something had changed. The bond between him and the wolves was real, stronger than he had ever imagined. They weren't just animals to him anymore. They were part of his life, part of his heart. The golden-eyed wolf moved first. It took a step forward, its body lowering slightly, as if inviting Jake to join them. The dark wolf followed, watching Jake with a gaze that seemed to see right through him. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what this meant, but he felt an undeniable pull. The wild was calling him, whispering to him in a way that no human world ever had. It was as if the wolves were asking him to understand them, to be part of their pack. But how could he? He wasn't a wolf. He couldn't live like they did, running free in the forest. He had responsibilities, people who depended on him. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger here, something that couldn't be explained. The golden-eyed wolf stepped closer, its fur brushing against Jake's leg. It looked up at him with those wise eyes, as if telling him that he wasn't meant to walk this path alone. Jake reached down and gently touched the wolf's head. The contact was electric, as if the wolf's energy flowed through him, filling him with a strange sense of peace. For a moment, the world seemed to fade away, and all Jake could feel was the wildness in the air, the ancient call of the forest. But then, reality returned. Jake took a step back, his heart pounding. "I can't," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't stay here. I have a life to live, and I can't leave it all behind." The golden-eyed wolf tilted its head, as if understanding. The dark wolf made a soft noise, and for a moment, Jake thought it was a growl, but it wasn't. It was like a quiet, mournful sound, as if the wolves knew that Jake had to make a choice between the life he had built and the wild, untamed world they lived in. Jake looked at the two wolves one last time. "I wish I could," he said softly, his voice almost breaking. "But this is your home, not mine." The golden-eyed wolf turned and began to walk away, the dark wolf following close behind. Jake stood still, his heart heavy as he watched them disappear into the trees, their forms melting into the shadows of the forest. As they disappeared from view, Jake let out a slow breath. He knew it was the right choice. The wolves belonged to the wild. He belonged to the world he had made for himself. Rosie nudged his side, bringing him back to the present. Jake smiled softly and petted her head. "Let's go home, girl," he said. "We've got a life to live." As he turned to leave, Jake felt a strange sense of peace. He knew he had made the right decision. The wolves would always be part of him, and he would carry their memory with him, like a secret whispered by the wind. And maybe, just maybe, one day, he would find his way back to the wild, where the call of the forest would be waiting for him. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal for Jake. The forest felt quieter without the wolves, but there was still something in the air, a sense of peace, of understanding. Every time he walked through the woods, he thought of the golden-eyed wolf and the dark one. He thought of how they had changed him, how they had shown him something deeper than he had ever known. But life couldn't stand still. Jake had responsibilities, and the days carried on, just as they always had. He spent his time working on the farm, taking care of Rosie, and making sure the cabin was in good shape. Yet, no matter how busy he kept himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. One cool autumn evening, after a long day of work, Jake decided to take a walk through the woods again. He didn't expect to see the wolves, but something inside him still hoped. Maybe it was just a way to honor the bond he had shared with them. Rosie trotted beside him, her tail wagging gently. She had grown used to these walks, even if the woods seemed emptier now. Jake often found himself talking to her, sharing his thoughts like he used to do with the wolves. It was as though Rosie was the one who understood him best. They reached the edge of the clearing where Jake had last seen the wolves. The sky was painted with the colors of sunset, pinks, oranges, and purples, filling the woods with a soft, golden light. For a moment, Jake stopped and just breathed in the fresh, crisp air. He didn't feel lonely. He felt connected to the world around him. Suddenly, Rosie stopped and sniffed the air, her ears twitching. She looked up at Jake, then back toward the trees. Jake furrowed his brow. Had Rosie sensed something? He followed her gaze, but saw nothing at first. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a flash of movement between the trees. It was quick, almost like a shadow, but it was familiar. The golden eyes. The same golden eyes he had come to know so well. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He didn't move, not wanting to startle whatever it was. Rosie barked softly and stepped forward, but Jake held her back. The golden-eyed wolf stepped into the clearing, its fur glowing in the fading sunlight. It was the same wolf. Jake was sure of it. The wolf stood still, watching Jake from a distance. Then, to Jake's surprise, the dark wolf appeared beside it, its eyes glowing in the soft light. Jake stood there, his heart racing. The wolves hadn't forgotten him. They were here, and they were watching him, like they had been waiting for something. For a moment, neither man nor wolf moved. The connection between them was strong, a silent understanding that had never truly faded. The wolves weren't asking Jake to return to their world. They were simply showing him that the bond they had shared would always remain, no matter where they were. Jake smiled softly, his heart full. "I see you," he whispered, as if speaking directly to the wolves. "I understand." The wolves didn't approach him this time. They simply stood together in the clearing, watching him with knowing eyes. After a long moment, the golden-eyed wolf turned and began to walk back into the trees, the dark wolf following close behind. Jake stood still for a while, watching them disappear into the forest, his heart calm and content. They were free. They were where they belonged, just as he was where he belonged, on his farm with Rosie, living the life he had chosen. As the wolves faded into the woods, Jake knew that he would never forget them. The wild had changed him, but it had also taught him something important. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can give to the wild, and to ourselves, is to let go, to understand that not everything can be ours to keep. Jake turned and walked back to the cabin, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The forest would always be there, a part of him, a part of the life he had built. And whenever he needed to remember, he could look to the woods and know that the wolves were still out there, free and wild, just as they were meant to be. As he entered the cabin, Rosie trotted ahead of him, tail wagging. Jake smiled down at her. "We're home, girl," he said softly. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt truly at peace.